Hi everybody, Steven here. If you want to learn about storage policies more specifically, if you want to learn more about vSan storage policies, that's what we're going to talk about. This is part of my vSan 101 series. This is part 3. See you in a bit. Hi everybody, thanks for sticking around. So what we're going to do is, and this has been requested, and I was planning on doing it, is we're going to take a look at the vSan storage policies. So the first couple of parts, part 1 we talked about what vSan is. Part 2 is we set up a vSan cluster. So if you haven't seen those videos, you want to watch those. I'll leave links for those at the end. Then what we're now going to do is talk about storage policies, creating VM. It's not kind of demo doing one real fast. But we'll go into take a look at a little bit deeper look at what storage policy are for vSan. So I normally like to throw this out there at this point. Hey, for those of you that subscribe to the channel, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please support the channel by subscribing to it. It does help me out quite a bit. It allows me to publish these videos. Also, if you want to support the channel, super thanks is enabled, but that's totally up to you. So let's get started. Now, before we jump right into it, let me get to my iPad. Real fast review on some of the options for storage policies. Okay, one of them is how do we want to protect our VMs? So we've got the failure to tolerate being one. So generally, you need at least 3 servers for that. A vSan. Now, I'm talking about the original storage architecture, and actually even the express storage architecture. So what happens? Your VM is basically an object, and I'll kind of show you that. And what we're going to do is your VM has components. These objects are made up of components. So if we're saying we want to tolerate a single failure, we're going to have one of the components put on one of the disks in the disk group on a server, another component on another disk group on another server, and last but not least, we'll have this witness component. And the obviously the purpose of this is failure to tolerate equals 1 is if this drive here should die, this VM is still functioning. If a host should die, let's say the drive is okay, let's say the complete host dies, the VM should still be accessible. Now, if the VM is running on this host, let's say the VM was on this host, and this host dies, well, the files that make up the VMs are still available. We still have more. We still have, in this example, we still have more. We have quorum. We have 2/3 available to us, right? So what will happen is this vSphere's HA will kick in, and maybe the VM will start over here and then access its components. Okay, so failure to tolerate, we need at least 1. We need at least 3 servers. Failure to tolerate, same kind of concept here. We need at least 5 servers. Basically, to determine the number of servers, it's 2n plus 1. When we talk about mirroring, 2n is the number of failures you want to tolerate. So 2 times 2 equals 4 plus 1 is 5. That's the minimum number of servers. So you'll see I've got a component here, and a component in this case over there. And I have 2 witnesses. This way we have an odd number, okay, to maintain quorum. Again, I could lose 2 components and still be okay. All right. Then there's the real paranoid one, failure to tolerate equals 3. So 2n plus 1. So that's 6 plus 1 is 7, so you need at least 7 servers. Same kind of concept. Okay. Then there's the RAID 5 erasure encoding. The original storage architecture, you need at least 4 servers. Okay. And what we do is we're striping the data across. So just like RAID 5, you're striping data. So your first stripe is data 1, data 2, and data 3. Then you have a checksum or a parity, right? Then your next stripe is a data stripe as well. You get data 4, 5, and 6. Then you have another parity, and we're skewing the parity, so you can see the parity being skewed. So in the original storage architecture, you need at least 4 servers. With Express, you need 3. I did a video on that specifically. Again, if there's a problem here, if we lose a server or drive or whatever, we lost basically our data 3 here. That's gone. Well, I could figure out what data 3 is by looking at parity, looking at data 2, and looking at data 1, and I can figure out what data 3 is. Same thing over here. I lost data 8. I can figure out what data 8 by looking at the parity, looking at data 7, and looking at data 9. So RAID 5, again, If I lose one, I'm still okay. If you lose two, you're dead in the water. Okay. And then RAID 6, sorry, that's talks about express storage architecture. I've already did videos on that. Express storage architecture actually has a thing called adaptive RAID 5. I'm not going to go into that, but need a minimum of 3 servers, okay, for RAID 5. And I'll just leave it at that. Watch that video. And RAID 6, again, for RAID 6 here, we need a minimum of 6 servers. Yeah, okay. And again, the advantage here is you basically have a failure to tolerate of 2. And so you have 2 parities, so 2 write parities. So if I lose 2, I can still figure out what I lost data 3 and data 2. I can figure out what data 2. Sorry, I can figure out what data 2 and data 3 is by looking at data 1, data 4, and the parities. Okay, so so those are the failures to tolerate. So why don't we just jump right into it now? Okay, so I'm in my vSphere, on my vCenter server. I've got my Site A data center. I've got a cluster over here. You'll notice I have an extra server. Don't worry, I'll do a video on adding servers later on, right? Looks like I got a license expiration coming up. Oops. Oh well, doesn't matter. Let's look at a couple things. Let's look at, I'm on my cluster. Let's go under configure. Let's go under vSan. Let's go under services here, and under services you'll see you've got your storage as vSan type. I kind of showed this in one of my videos here. I want to show you what the default storage policy is. The default is right here, vSan default storage policy, and you can edit that and change it to something else if you want to. Okay, but I'll show you how to create policies. These modes over here, verbose mode and network diagnostics mode, these are really made for troubleshooting. You don't want to turn these on unless you're talking to VMware support, okay? Because it's going to collect a bunch of information for performance metrics and all that stuff to do the troubleshooting. So don't just turn those on. In fact, if you turn them on, I think it's after a few days you get an alert saying you forgot to turn it off. But anyway, don't just blindly turn them on, okay? I'm going to leave that alone. So I could change my storage policy if I want to, but my default is the vSan default storage policy right there. Well, what is the vSan default storage policy? Let's cancel this. Let's go under here, and let's go into policies and profiles. Now, under policy and profile, there's a whole bunch of stuff in there that we could do. Now, we could do so. First of all, a policy is basically you put on a VM, and a policy can dictate how we want to protect our VM. What level of encryption do we want? What fault tolerance do we want? What type of I/O characteristics do we want? There's a whole lot of stuff you can do with policies, right? From a vSAN perspective, it's dictating potentially how we want to protect it. I just talked about failure to tolerate a 1, failure to tolerate a 2, failure to tolerate a 3. How we want to protect it, we want to do mirroring or RAID 5. We can also do encryption and stuff like that. And your storage policy, your vSAN storage policy can also impact performance as well, which I'll touch on a bit. So if I go in here, you'll see that there's a bunch of policies already here. VM encryption and policy, that's nothing to do with vSAN, but you can do encryption on VMs if you want to. The vSAN storage policy, let me select that, right? And then when I select it, there we go. Well, you disappeared, that's weird. Anyways. Let's try that again. So I select it. Oh, that's why. There's one selected down below. That's really tricky. Let's expand this a bit. I had one selected down below. So you'll see there's a bunch of them over here, right? If I select on my vSAN default storage policy, I got to move this up a bit so you can see it. You'll see it's the vSAN default storage policy, which is fine. It's failure to tolerate equals 1. number of stripes is 0. IO limits, there's no IO limits. Thin provisioning, there's a bunch of stuff here that we can actually set. And this is what's set on here. Now, you can edit the default one, which I'm not a big fan of doing that, editing default policies, because if I walk into your environment and I don't know it and I say, oh, you're using the vSan storage policy. Well, I know that's RAID 1, right? Well, you might have changed it to something different. Sorry, I might have said, oh, that's failure to tolerate 1. You might have changed your default to failure to tolerate 2. I would actually leave this one alone and create your own, and then go in at the cluster level and change what you want it to be the default. That would make more sense. If I move this down, again, you'll see there's other policies here. Management, these are vVols. This is a vVol. We're not dealing with virtual volumes. It's nothing to do with vSan. Management storage policy, regular. Again, this is a vSan type storage policy. Disaster recovery tolerance is none, so this is not a clustered across sites. It's a failure to tolerate a 1, and so on, right? And it's thick provisioning. So there's some defaults here. They talk about the storage policy being regular, thin provisioning. If you look down here, you see this thin. Large is thick provisioning, a failure to tolerate a 2 using RAID 1. So there are some here. You see there's stretch clusters, stretch light, single node, all kinds of some default ones here. You could use these. You know what? We're going to create our own, okay, folks? How about that? Actually, before we jump into creating our own, let's go create a VM, right? Let's do that. Let's go into inventory. Let's right-click on the cluster, say new virtual machine, and I'm going to create a new VM. I don't care what operating system. I'll call this VM1. I'm going to go next. I don't care. Okay, it's on my cluster 1. I'm going to pick vSan, right? And it's asking me my storage policy here. I can say use the data stores default, which in this case I'm selecting vSan, or from here I can actually go in and select, be more specific. I want to use the vSan default policy if you want to. Okay, so let's pick that, and then I'm going to click next. It's asking me compatibility, operating system, all that garbage. I don't care. I'm just going to leave it alone and go next, and finished. And let's just see what my okay, so basically I just created that VM. Let's right click, let's just power it on just for the heck of it. Power it on. Now it's got the vSan default policy. What did I say it was? Is failure to tolerate equals 1, right? Let's click on the VM, let's go under monitor, and let's go under physical disk placement, and let's look at this. Now you'll see over here, it's actually showing me the components that making up that VM. So it's showing me, so first of all, remember I said vSan in part 1, vSan I was going to say vSan objects are stored as objects. So data stored as an object on the vSan data store. So we see we have our hard drive here. We see we have a swap object. And we see we have a home directory. Think of that as the config, right? So these are the objects that make up a VM. The home directory, the swap, the virtual disk, right? And since we got a failure to tolerate a 1, you see there's a component there on host 1. A component here on host 3, and then the witness component on host 4, sort of like my picture. Here's the swap file. It's got a component on host 1, a component on host 2, and a witness on host 4, and then the home directory itself, it's got a component on host 4, a component on host 2, and a witness on host 1. So again, if one of these should fail, and it shows me the disk that's on as well, right? If one of these should fail, that object will still be okay. I can say group components by host placement if you want to look at it like that, whichever view tickles your fancy. So right now I'm looking at host 1, and it's showing me various information about host 1 and what components are being stored and stuff. Okay, so depending on what view you're comfortable with, I'm going to leave this one. That's the one I'm kind of used to be honest with you. Right now, what I can so that kind of makes sense. Now let's go in and create our own storage policy. Let's go into here. Let's go into policies and profiles, and I'm going to say storage policy. I'm going to say create. Give it a name that makes sense. Okay, don't call it storage policy 1 or something silly like I'm going to do. I'll call it Steve RAID 5. Okay, now click next. Now over here, it gives you a bunch of options for your policy. Remember, it doesn't have to be vSan type technology here. It could be other partners integration solution, it could be encryption policies, right? So I can enable host-based rules. If you got some kind of third-party solution installed on your host to give that VM more capabilities, you can enable that. I don't care. I'm just going to say this is for vSan. So that's what I'm going to select. You can do vSan Direct. I'll probably talk a little bit about that. vSan Direct, let me do a video on it. I don't know how popular that is, but allows you to not claim all the disks in your vSan cluster and use it like almost like a pass-through to your VMs. I'll just leave it at that. Enable rules for VMFS storage if you've got those capabilities. Tag-based rules. Again, remember, I can create policies and it has nothing to do with vSan, okay? Storage policies, storage topologies as well. I haven't played with this one, enable consumption domain. My understanding of this, it's used, I'm not a container person, but it's used for Kubernetes and containers and stuff like that. So you have different failure domains and the storage is advertised as such. That's my understanding. But anyways, you know what, we're talking about vSan. Let's just stick with that, okay? So I'm going to go next. Now it's asking me site disaster tolerance. Do I have multiple sites here? Yes or no, right? So, and I can pick the site that I want. I'll probably do a video on maybe like, I'll probably do some kind of site video on that and we'll check those out. But host mirroring, 2-node cluster, site mirroring, stretch cluster, none, keep all your data on the preferred or on the secondary, or none, it's just a stretch cluster. So I'm going to say none, it's a standard cluster, okay? Now this is where, so this part here talks mainly about if you're doing like stretch clusters and stuff. Failures to tolerate, this is what we're looking at really in this video, is I don't want any redundancy. That's like RAID 0, so you're not going to be protected. No data redundancy with host affinity. It means it's the same thing as that first one, but I want to keep it on one host. This would be something like maybe for some kind of, oh shoot, it's on the tip of my tongue. Some kind of compute-based cluster where availability is done at the application level, not at the physical level, right? So your whatever Hadoop type stuff, right? Where availability is done within the application level. So we'll leave those two. These are the more common ones you're going to probably find in vSan. Failure to tolerate RAID 1 is mirroring. Failure to tolerate RAID 5, erasure and closing, encoding. Failure to tolerate RAID 1 mirroring. Failure to tolerate 2 failures, RAID 6, and 3 failures, RAID 1, which I just talked about. Let's do a RAID 5, okay? So we're doing a RAID 5 here. Now notice obviously it's complaining. Am I recording? Yeah. Notice it's complaining. RAID 5 enclosure requires all flash configuration. Why is it complaining? Let's look at the next screen, okay? Storage rules. So under these, now I could actually just hit next if I want to, right? But under storage rules, these are some extra stuff and advanced policy rules and tags that you could set up for your policy. Remember, I said it doesn't just have to be vSan stuff. Now, under storage rules, I can actually enable encryption services, right? And I can enable space efficiency. Notice over here, encryption services, data at rest encryption, no preference. What's the difference between no encryption and no preferences? You'll see it over here as well. I want to do dedupe and compression. I want to do just compression only. Excuse me. No space efficiency, or I really don't care one way or the other. The difference between these no's and the no preference is, for example, encryption. If I've got no encryption and you put that VM on a data store that has encryption, it'll say that VM is non-compliant because you don't want encryption. If you say no preference here, it'll say, oh, it's stored on a data store that has encryption. Who cares? Or it's stored on a data store that doesn't have encryption. Who cares? That's okay. It'd still be compliant. Same thing with space efficiency. No space efficiency, say that 10 times fast, or no preference. So again, if I stored it on a volume that has space efficiency, dedupe, compression, all that enabled, it would say, hang on a second, you're non-compliant because I don't want that. So I'm just going to say no preference. Storage tier. Now you can be specific. Okay, depending on your environment, you can say I want this VM to be stored on an all-flash environment, vSan, or I want it to be stored on a hybrid. Okay. Remember, these are policies. I can have multiple vSan clusters in my environment. So I got my vCenter server. I can have multiple clusters. Each of them are different vSANs with different levels of capabilities. And I can have a policy there. So I could have maybe one cluster that's all flash. This VM must stay on a cluster that's all flash. Or I have a hybrid vSAN, which again, in part one, I talked about hybrid. It's a combo of a flash or storage, or sorry, SSD for cache, and spindle disk for storage, right? So you can say no preference, that sort of thing. Now, why is it complaining? RAID 5 requires all flash configuration. So because I specified RAID 5, over here, it's saying you cannot do RAID 5 on a hybrid. So I have to fix this. I have to say this has to be all flash. There we go. Okay, that's why it was red. Advanced policies. Number of disk stripes. I'll see if I got time to talk about this one, but generally leaving it at the default of 1. It can go from 1 to 12, and this is if I want to do striping of my objects. This can get a little bit fun. I may do a separate video on it. I'll see what our time is on for this one. But for now, I'm just going to leave it at 1. That's one of the recommended parameters. Just blindly changing this is not a good idea. You can specify I/O limits for the VM as well. You can also specify space reservations. vSAN stores stuff as an object, and by default it's thin provision. So you could actually say, I want to do thick provisioning, thin, or you want to do a certain amount of reservation. What does that mean? Basically, when I do thin provisioning, actually a percentage of logical storage, right? So basically, when I say I want to do thin provisioning, it doesn't take up all the vSAN storage for that VM. So if it was 90 gig disk, it's not going to be a 90 gig object, okay? Over here, you can specify how much you want to reserve for this VM. So just in case you get into a situation where you're deploying VMs and VMs and VMs on this vSAN data store, and you're overcommitting your space, you may run into problems, right? If there's certain VMs you're saying, I don't want those VMs to have problems, I want to make sure they get the disk they need, you can say thick provisioning, or you can reserve certain amounts. So that space is taken away from vSAN, so no other VMs could use it, okay? Except for the ones that have these reservations. So I'm just going to leave it at thin. Flash read cache reservation. Okay, so remember we used to get cache level. Again, would not be in the express storage architecture. I'll probably do a separate video on that, on set one up, but I did talk about it in part one. So for the original storage architecture, flash read cache reservation, you could reserve X amount percentage of that cache for reads for this VM or these VMs that use this policy to ensure a certain level of performance. So you can mess with stuff like that. Again, I wouldn't just blindly go in there and start changing these things just because you feel like it, okay? This is something you can play with on the fly and try things out and do benchmarking. But I'm going to leave the default. Disable object checksum. This I don't know, this looks really backwards to me. So when I select this, that means I am not doing checksumming. When I deselect it, I am doing checksumming, right? It's kind of the opposite. Green is you're disabling it, isn't it the other way around? How I look at this is, remember I talked about RAID 5? And this comes back to my IBM days with storage and stuff like that. When you store stuff out onto your disk, your disk controllers a lot of times will go out and do like a check on that data. For example, it would look at the data 1, data 2, and data 3 and the parity, and would make sure that those things add up properly, right? It's called scrubbing. I think it's called scrubbing back in the day, right? On the IBM storage. I don't know what the other people called it. That's how I look at with this. Is am I going to check and make sure everything is okay, right? If you're going to make this policy just for VMs you don't care about, yeah, you could probably disable this. I wouldn't do this in production, to be honest with you. That's just my personal opinion. Forced provisioning. I'll give you an example of this one shortly, okay? But let's leave that one off for now. Tags. Now, one of the things, this really has nothing to do with vSAN. I can have my data stores. Let's say I have different data stores. Forget about vSAN. I can have different data stores with different types of performance characteristics or whatever. And I could put tags on them, right? And then I could actually have my VMs create storage policies looking for data stores with a certain tag. Like this is my gold tier tag. bronze tag, silver tag, right? So VMs that are in the gold tier get the better performance. I could do policies based on that. Technically, really nothing to do with vSan, but you can take advantage of it if you want to. Personally, I don't care. I'm going to leave it off. So I'm going to go next, and then it shows me my compatible data stores with this policy. Yep, vSan, great. I'll go next, and I'll go finish. Right? Let me just go to my recent task, and it's done. Let's create a VM now. Let's go back into here. Let's go into inventory. Right click on the cluster, new virtual machine. I'll go next. VM2. Next, whatever cluster. I'll pick the vSan data store. Now I'm going to pick that Steve's RAID 5 policy. There we go. I'll go next. Whatever. Finished. And then I'm just going to power on that VM. Actually, yeah, I'm going to power on the VM. Let's power it on. Where you go? Power it on. There's no operating system. I don't care. I don't need it for that. Now, if I go to VM1, actually, let's go back to VM2. We'll go into monitor, under vSan, physical displacement. Did it do it? Notice this one here. Again, we basically have 4 components. Remember RAID 5? Hang on a second. Here we go. Remember, oh, that's adaptive RAID 5. Let's go back to here. RAID 5 on original storage architecture. Basically, it's got 1, 2, 3, 4 components. One of those components is a parity, right? If we go back to the screen now, so you'll see VM2 there. When I look at under a monitor, under vSan physical displacement, you'll see my hard disk. It's got components 1, 2, 3, and 4. There's 4 components there, right? The 3 data that's in the parity. The swap file, again, there's 4, and then there's the home, right? So all of them have that. Let's do this. Let's go to VM1, and notice again it's got component witness. So that's the failure to tolerate a 1. That's mirroring. Let's go in and edit the settings. Notice the VM is powered on. Edit settings. Let's go into hard disk 1. Let's change the storage policy to Steve's RAID 5. Come on, Steve's RAID 5. Did I select it? Steve's RAID 5. I'll say OK. So away we go here. Let me just refresh this screen. Boom, you notice hard disk 1 now on VM1 is components 1, 2, there's 4 components. Again, we're doing RAID 5. Look at the swap, the virtual machine swap is still RAID 1. And the virtual machine, where's the home? The home is still RAID 1. So those objects are still RAID 1. So I could go on the individual disk and specify a different policy if I want to. Look at the VM. Let's right click on the VM. Let's go into, what do I want here? VM policies, edit storage policies, and you'll notice over there the home is using the default stand policy, the vSan policy, and the hard disk 1 is using the RAID 5 policy. Okay, I'm going to notice this says configure on a per disk basis. So you could do that. You could specify a policy, different policy for each disk. Now, an example of that I'm thinking of on this, what maybe, I don't care if my boot disk has encryption, but my data disk, the stuff where I store my customer data, I want that encrypted, right? That might be an example. Leave your comments down below if you think of something else. Again, I'm not sure if I want like my data RAID 1 and my booting RAID 5. I don't know about that, right? Whatever. You could save space on that if you think about it, right? Okay. Let's say I want to do this. I don't want it on a per disk basis. If I deselect that, now the whole VM will get the policy I dictate up here. So notice I've selected the vSan, the default vSan storage policy, and I'll say OK. And then if I notice over here, see the 4 components. Hard disk 1 is RAID 5. Let's refresh. Hard disk 1 is RAID 1 now. Okay. Let's try something else out. Let's try that forced provisioning thing. Okay. Let's go into policies and profiles. Let's say create, and let's do a new one. Steve's RAID 6, and I'm going to say enable for vSan. I'm not dealing with stretch clusters or anything. Let's go RAID 6. Oops, RAID 6. It's going to complain. Same kind of thing as before. That has to be all flashed. Great. Under advanced policies, disable checksum. Okay, force provisioning. How many servers do I need for RAID 6? How many? Actually, let's leave this. Let's not disable force provision. Let's leave it. Next. It shows me no compatible data store. I'll go next and finish. Let's create a new VM. Inventory. The clue should have been that no compatible data store. Let's right click, new virtual machine. We'll call it VM3. VM3. Cluster 1. I'll pick vSan. I'll pick RAID 6. Notice there's problems. It's showing me there's problems here. I can say show details if I want to. Let's not. Let's go next. Next. I don't care about the rest of the stuff. I go finish. Notice it couldn't do it. Couldn't complete. It's because let's go back to my iPad. For RAID 6, I need 2, 4, 6 servers. I only got 4. So it's not going to let me do it. Let's try this out. Let's go back to here. Let's go into storage policies and profiles. Let's go to, where's these RAID 6? Right there. We'll go edit. We'll go next, advanced, force provisioning. I'm going to turn that on. I'm going to go next. Notice the vSan data store is compatible with it. Next, finish. Now, let's try this out. Let's create a new VM. There's 2 things I want to show you, then we're pretty much done, okay? Let's inventory, right click. Let's say new virtual machine. Next. We'll call this VM4. We'll go next. Whatever cluster, the data store, we'll pick RAID 6. Notice it says it's compatible. So whatever, I don't care. And it's created it. I can right click and I can power it on. And then if I look at my displacements and components, if I refresh this, yeah, it's coming up RAID 0 here. In this case, which is actually rather interesting. I thought it would do a RAID 5, but I guess it knows. So now, if I go in and add in 2 more servers, what it should automatically do is say, oh, I now have the capabilities to provide RAID 6, and it would actually stripe that information across it, okay? So this force provisioning, let's try one more thing, force provisioning. Let me right click on VM1. Let's edit settings. I'm going to change the disk on here, hard disk. I'm going to change it to the RAID 6 policy. It should fail. Pick the RAID 6. Okay. Comes up and it fails. Out of resources. It's saying you can't change that to RAID 6. Well, hang on. You put force provisioning, Steve. Why didn't it work? Force provisioning is there for, imagine this scenario. You're deploying a new environment. You're still waiting on a couple servers to come in or something like that. Needed to get some VMs up and running, and the level of protection that you want is not so critical, but you want to get this stuff up and running, and then Monday morning when the stuff comes in, the servers come in, you'll add it to the cluster, and away you go, right? That's really what it's there for. I think it's kind of dangerous because you're now saying, I don't care about fault tolerance. So right now, so VM4, if I go back to the summary tab on VM4, if I scroll down, you'll see it's non-compliant. Storage policy is non-compliant. Okay? So that means that that machine's not protected. If I lose a server, that guy's most likely going to be dead in the water. Okay? So you're saying I don't care about fault tolerance. So that force provisioning is something I would use very, very carefully. Okay? I think that's about it. I know I didn't talk about stripes. I'll do a separate video on that. I think that would take a bit of time, and I'd like to do some demos on it. By the way, if you enjoy the video, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, folks, please subscribe to the channel. It's a way for you to support the channel. Without subscribers, there's no content, right, folks? So that's it. Thanks again. See you in the next one. Bye now.